All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as we have folks trickling in. Thank you again for folks on the East Coast and also in Europe. I know we're joining from a bunch of different time zones. As I mentioned, we're going to get started in just a couple of moments here. We have folks trickling in just a few minutes after 9:30. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. We're really happy to have you. We're gathered here today to talk about the EU Deforestation Regulation updates. This is a really interesting topic. This is a topic that has garnered a lot of conversation over the last few weeks. Most folks are aware that the EU Commission published its report on the deforestation regulation on May 4th. Obviously, this was the highly anticipated report that they originally had anticipated publishing at the end of April. They were a few days late, but just barely missed that deadline. And we received some really interesting updates coming out of their report. So we're going to walk through those major updates today, what those mean for your business, what some of the implications are from that report and from the guidance and FAQs that were published. There were some really interesting takeaways from that guidance and FAQs drop that came out as a result of the report. Obviously, there's now been a lot of time between the last round of guidance and FAQs and this recent drop. So quite a bit of additional questions that were submitted from stakeholders made it into this recent guidance and FAQs from the Commission. So some really critical questions were answered here. So we're going to talk through some of those scenarios that were answered. And we want to get to some questions from the audience. I'm sure there will be some questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible today. I'm sure there will be some that we miss or we run out of time. But throughout the webinar, you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a Q&A button. You can submit questions anonymously if you so choose. If you click on that button, submit questions throughout the webinar. And again, we'll try to get to them towards the end of the session. If we don't have a chance to answer your questions at the conclusion of the webinar, we'll have our contact information at the end up on a screen. So you're welcome to email both of us and submit your questions that way. Without further ado, I want to just briefly introduce both myself and my co-host here. My name is Marissa Brock. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at Sourcemap. I'm joined by our founder and CEO, Leonardo Bonanni. And we're really happy to welcome you to Unpacking EUDR Updates for Operators and Traders, how the latest review from the Commission impacts your business. So let's dive right in. I think we can go to the next slide, Leo.
Yeah. One setup.
Okay. So I know that one of the things that we want to start with here is because one of the critical updates from this report was the inclusion of this additional scope for EUDR that adds some additional HS codes. It also removes some HS codes, but we're going to start with the additional HS codes. There are some products that were not previously exposed to EUDR that now, for the first time, are having to think about compliance with the deforestation regulation. They don't have additional time to comply. They still have that December 30th deadline. So this is, a scramble for some of those products that, again, were not previously thinking about EUDR compliance. So while this may seem a little redundant for folks who have now been thinking about EUDR now for years, through these several rounds of delays that the Commission has put in place for EUDR, we do just want to start with a quick overview of obligations under EUDR. This latest round of guidelines and FAQs really reaffirmed some of the obligations that also were clarified in the simplification text that was agreed upon in December, last December, December of 2025. So we want to just start there. So if you look at this screen here on the left-hand side, we're going to go left to right here. On the data requirements side, really the most important elements of EUDR are those data requirements. What actually needs to be collected by operators that are subject to the regulation. So the most critical elements of the regulation are which HS codes are subject to EUDR compliance. You can find those in the annex of the adopted text. If you are a new HS code that was just added to the regulation in the annex delegated act that was just submitted. So if you look at the report that the commission submitted on May 4th, a delegated act was submitted, and then an annex to the delegated act was also submitted. If you look at that annex, the additional HS codes were included there. So if you're a new HS code, you can view those additional HS codes in that annex. If you are an HS code that was previously subject to the regulation, you can look at the original adopted text. That's really where you start to see if you have products, commodities and derived products that are subject to the regulation. So that's really the foundational element to see whether you need to comply with EUDR. Other data requirements are quantities. This is something that needs to be submitted on your due diligence statement. Collecting the producers for your due diligence statements is also really important. Farms and forests, this is really a critical element, of course. One of the most important elements really is the geolocation of those farms and the polygons. So this is what we want to, focus on if we're an operator that is subject to the regulation, looking at those plots of land from which your commodities and products are coming from, and screening those polygons for deforestation, ensuring that they are deforestation-free past the deadline for the regulation, and ensuring that they are compliant. We'll talk a little bit about the legality element, which is, of course, important for the regulation as well. It's not just important to confirm are your farms and plots of land deforestation free, but also are the products that have been placed on the EU market, has legality due diligence been conducted as well? That's also important for operators. So all of these elements are really, really important. The frequency for which you're submitting due diligence statements to the EU Traces system, this is a really interesting element that the EU Commission has been a little bit flexible about. You can either submit due diligence statements to EU Traces as products are being placed on the EU market. Some operators choose to do this. So this is the most frequent way in which you're submitting due diligence statements as those products are being placed on the EU market or exported from the EU. Again, you're only submitting due diligence statements for products that are first placed on the EU market. But also you can submit due diligence statements to EU Traces in advance. So let's say you know that you place a regular order of products in a given 12-month period. You can submit a due diligence statement with the quantity of those products that will be placed on the EU market within 12 months from the date that the due diligence statement is submitted to the EU Traces system. As long as those products are placed on the EU market within that 12-month period from the submission date to EU Traces, that due diligence statement is still valid. So there is a little bit of flexibility there that the Commission has allowed to, again, just account for the fact that for some companies, it is challenging to have to submit due diligence statements as products are being placed on the market. And then the customs reporting piece, we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail as we progress throughout the webinar. But this is an element that falls a little bit outside of specifically the legal requirements of the Deforestation Regulation. But once we step outside of what operators are actually required to do, the primary operators who have legal obligations under EUDR that have to submit due diligence statements to the EU Traces system, that have to collect due diligence reference numbers from those due diligence statements that they're submitting to EU Traces. If you're a downstream operator and trader, so you're submitting derived products or you're placing derived products on the EU market, or you're reselling products as a trader within the EU system. There is a customs reporting element that is, again, outside of the EUDR legal requirement, where in order to prove, for example, that you are a downstream operator and you do not have any obligation to submit another due diligence statement to the EU Traces system as a reimporter, for example, you would, on your customs forms to reimport a good back into the European Union that has been previously imported, it's now exported, it's being reimported, you would include the due diligence reference number on that customs reporting. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to go fully into the detail on that now since we're early on in the webinar. We're going to get into the details there. But the customs reporting element is an interesting component here because, again, this falls outside of what is legally required under the EUDR requirements. But because the customs element is important for EUDR, for downstream operators and traders to prove that they actually don't have to submit due diligence statements to EU Traces. This is something that downstream operators and traders do need to think about and make sure that they're aware of and maintaining the proper data elements for. So I'll pause there and Leo, hand it over to you to talk about some of the success factors. How do we, make sure that operators are really meeting these data requirements and meeting these obligations under EUDR? There's so many elements to think about here.
Thanks, Marissa. Yeah, and hi, everyone. This is actually a very well-attended meeting. So as you may have noticed, we're answering questions on the Q&A on the side. We're getting a lot of technical questions. So I'm glad that we brought this slide up, obviously for all the people who are newly covered by EUDR, but also anybody who has questions in general. We're still getting a lot of questions while Marissa was talking about the frequency of reporting, the legality component, so the middle column, supplier due diligence as compared with the due diligence statements. And it's very confusing because the DDS are those statements with polygons that need to be submitted as frequently as required to faithfully represent the sourcing of those products. So it could be for every shipment, it could be for every batch of shipments. That supplier due diligence is really a once-a-year exercise. It should be done before the year starts, and suppliers should be compliant on all categories. Otherwise, they should not be able to place EUDR products on the market. But it's only once a year, and so it could be bundled in. So I'm just reiterating that because we're seeing a lot of questions around those topics. Look, if you're a company of a certain size and you maybe more than the size of the company, if you have to submit thousands of due diligence statements every year, then the managing the successful implementation of an EUDR compliance platform is actually something that goes beyond meeting the requirements for the due diligence statements and for the legality. It also requires building internal business processes, support networks with third parties, and a system of record that can faithfully carry out all of these requirements. And at the end of the day, this is a law with a enormous potential penalties, and we've seen how the EU sometimes wields enforcement, especially for very visible companies with known brands, as a way to show their strength, and especially sometimes foreign companies. So it is a serious concern that an investigation could happen. In our experience, we have extensive experience at Sourcemap dealing with government investigations on behalf of our customers in the corporate sector. And really having a robust system of record and workflows that are completely automated is the best defense, because every piece of data has a clean audit trail, a chain of custody. Every user interaction, every piece of data has been validated using third-party validation. And so you can clearly point to an objective record that indicates that there has been no negligence at all, and complete adherence to the law. So if there are any problems along the way, you have a completely defensible case to make. So in order to get to that level of comfort for companies of a certain scale, these are the success factors that we've seen that need to be considered. And so I just want to make sure to talk on them. They're not actually requirements of the law. They're requirements of successful deployment of a system of record. So having the ability to monitor the policy, I don't think I need to tell anybody here that this law has had a lot more changes than anybody expected in terms of timeline and scope. Keeping that watch ongoing, we expect there will be more changes. There will be more changes to the Traces platform. There will be changes to automated validations and risk screenings that the platform is capable of doing. They've had a long time to build this software, and it is going to do a lot more than it was originally going to be able to do 2 years ago when it was going to launch. So having a policy watch partner, preferably that is influencing the constant updating of the system of record, because those changes, like right now we're expecting Traces to have a new API. We're expecting to make those updates and to be live with them very quickly thereafter. So this is the kind of process that you need to manage. Project management, so managing the business transformation, it is not a clean policy in the sense that no company can handle EUDR from strictly a compliance point of view, like financial reporting. Nobody can handle it from a strictly supply chain point of view. So there needs to be tight management of collaboration between IT, procurement, and legal compliance at a minimum. And we've seen other companies where 4, 5, 6 teams need to work together to make EUDR a reality. Integration, again, if you have thousands of DDSs to submit, more often than not, that means that the process should be automated from ERP. Every time a purchase order is issued, every time a new supplier is onboarded, that should be what triggers the DDS and the supplier due diligence. And it's the only way to make sure that it happens fast enough to clear customs when the time comes. Supplier outreach is not often talked about, but even this, despite the global scope of EUDR, we still see in Q3 of 26, we still see suppliers that have never done this before. Q2, Q3, we've trained them. We've brought them up to speed with mobile applications they can use to make maps. We've explained to them what the problems are with the data formats. Polygon mapping is still not a widely practiced technical skill. And so having the ability to train suppliers, to onboard them, to support them through all of their data questions is key. Never forget customs facilitation. These are ultimately the DDS number. The DDS reference number needs to be included in a customs declaration. And so at the end of the loop, at the end of the process, is your customs broker or whoever does the filing on your behalf. And sometimes they're in the beginning of the loop too, because if there's a drop shipment, if there's a disruption, if a DDS didn't go through, they're the ones that are responsible for talking to customs and trying to clear that shipment if there's any hiccup along the way. So we often see them, unfortunately, being the last to hear about this, but they should actually be quite early on in the process. And then last but not least, but I mentioned it, the system of record is really, really important. It has to have 5-year data retention. It has to track all the changes to the data. It's extremely important that it be secure, audited, and that you have a place to point a finger to every single time the data was changed. You could be running a polygon through a satellite analysis one day, and it could come back negative. You could run it again the next day, and it could come back positive. So you need to be able to point a finger at exactly which analysis was run using which raw data, which satellite, which day, and be able to keep on rerunning those analyses to stay up to date. The supply chains are constantly changing, and the deforestation data is also constantly being updated. So success factors that we've seen along the way. I don't know, Marissa, if there's anything that I'm missing in how we went through that, or if we should just go to the next slide on the simplification.
No, I think this is really comprehensive. One thing I would be remiss if we don't address, since it is on this slide, is just the supplier due diligence element. I think this is actually a good transition into the next slide because we are going to talk about some of those announcements from the Commission, and one of those announcements was around the creation of this database for legality due diligence that will be populated by third countries where they can actually upload relevant legislation that is pertinent to EUDR. On this slide, we did want to address the supplier due diligence element is a really critical component of EUDR. This is what people refer to when they're talking about legality. The primary upstream operator is solely responsible for the legality element of EUDR. This has historically been sort of the complex, stress-inducing part of EUDR because it has been ill-defined in the previous iterations of the guidance and FAQs. For companies that have been thinking about this, they've often been challenged by, how do I ensure that I'm compliant with every single relevant piece of legislation in every sourcing country that I'm sourcing commodities and products from. The Commission previously included these 7 categories of laws. They're listed here. You can obviously see them on the screen. But was clear about the fact that legality is intended to be flexible. This does not mean that if there is not a law in place governing the farms and forests from which you are sourcing commodities and products that covers those commodities and products, these categories are not necessarily relevant unless there is a law in that country for these categories. So again, it is flexible depending on the countries that your commodities and products are sourcing from. That is why the Commission took a lot of this feedback that it was getting from stakeholders and is now announcing that this database will be launched. Third countries will be able to upload that relevant legislation. An important piece and some important context is the Commission is not going to be populating that database. The third countries will actually be the ones populating the database. So, not every country is necessarily going to have the same amount of information depending on the level of resources that they have to populate this. Thinking this through, this is a lot of work to populate this database, to put information in here about all of the relevant legislation that might apply to plots of land for EUDR for all of these categories or really any of these categories, frankly. So without the resources and the staff and the policy expertise necessarily, dedicated policy expertise, I should say, to do this, it remains to be seen what this will look like for all of the countries that from which EUDR commodities are really coming from. But I think the sentiment is there that having this database is really important, and the Commission really did take feedback from stakeholders that this was something that was needed. So legality due diligence, as I said, is really an important piece. This really should be thought of as supplier due diligence. This needs to be done at least once a year. This is really a supplier questionnaire, essentially, collecting this information from your suppliers, making sure that you're also collecting evidence from suppliers, and ensuring that you're meeting that negligible risk criteria from suppliers based on the information that the Commission has provided in order to meet that criteria. So legality due diligence, again, is really important for the primary upstream operator. So I didn't want to skip over that. That is really an important piece to think about if you are a primary operator.
We're getting a lot of questions already. It's actually, there's a lot of you on this webinar regarding Re-imports. Actually, we got one that you could answer now because you already touched on it. But do you want to go to the simplification first?
Let's go to the simplification, yeah, because we actually do. I think I included on here or wanted to mention the re-import scenario. So perhaps this may answer the question that's in the chat. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but um, I'll quickly walk through this and then we can talk about the question since I know I'm seeing a lot of these as well. Um, as I mentioned, this report came out from the commission on the 4th. These are sort of the main things the main takeaways from that report. We really saw a clarification of the due diligence obligations in the sense that the primary upstream operators are really the ones that are responsible for the full EUDR due diligence. That means the collection of that farm and forest data, the deforestation analysis for those farms and forests, the legality due diligence, as I mentioned, the submission of due diligence statements to traces. Again, downstream operators and traders are not submitting any due diligence statements to traces. Only the primary upstream operators are submitting those due diligence statements to traces. Downstream operators and traders need to register in traces, register their business in traces, but they are not submitting due diligence statements to traces for their downstream products. So that is a major clarification. This was obviously something that was agreed upon in the simplified text back in December, but this was really sort of solidified in this in the guidance and FAQs that came out the most recent guidance and FAQs. And then again, the passing along of the due diligence reference numbers to suppliers downstream. This was another clarification that I think was really critical from the commission in this recent round of guidance and FAQs. It is the responsibility of the primary upstream operator to pass reference numbers downstream. It is not the responsibility of the downstream operators and traders to request the reference numbers from their upstream operators. It is very explicitly noted in the guidance and FAQs that if the first downstream operator or first trader does not receive a reference number from their upstream suppliers, they can, in good faith, assume that their suppliers are not primary operators. So what does that mean if we're sort of thinking about that from an audit standpoint? This does sort of protect downstream operators and traders from the audit responsibilities to some degree. This does not necessarily suggest that downstream operators and traders would never be audited by competent authorities. We don't necessarily know what the audits are going to look like, but if the responsibility really is on the primary upstream operators, this does really imply and suggest that primary upstream operators really bear, 95% of that responsibility in terms of both due diligence and really that risk and obligation there. Because, the downstream operators and traders, they're not the ones requesting the reference numbers. They do have the responsibility when they receive reference numbers to retain those reference numbers for that 5-year data retention period. The re-import scenarios that we're getting a few questions about for downstream operators that do have a re-import scenario. This is specifically mentioned in the guidance and FAQs. I'm sure that there were a lot of questions submitted to the commission about this. I'll touch on this briefly before I get through the rest of the elements in this slide, and then we'll get to the additional questions around this. But I do think this is an important one to touch on because this applies to a lot of downstream operators. If you are a downstream operator that has a good that is being re-imported to the EU, so specifically that means there's a commodity that has been imported into the EU. You're not necessarily that first importer. A different company has imported a commodity into the European Union. It has then separately been exported back out of the EU. It's transformed into a derived product. Now you, as a downstream operator, are re-importing that good back into the EU as a different derived product with the commodities that were previously imported into the EU. To prove that that is a downstream good that does not require another due diligence statement or a due diligence statement because it already has one, you either use the original due diligence reference number on your customs forms when you are re-importing into the EU and additional evidence. So in the guidance and FAQs, you can find some examples of additional evidentiary documentation that they suggest. This can be evidence, any documents between the original importer and the original importer and the exporter, between you as the re-importer and the exporter, basically any documentation proving that the good was already imported into the EU previously. In addition to that reference number, if you don't have the original reference number, you are allowed to use that generic reference number that the Commission provides and will provide. So again, this does actually provide an out. The Commission does provide an out for downstream operators. If you don't have the actual reference number for the good as a downstream operator, there's always the option to use the generic reference number that the Commission will provide. If you don't have access to these now, the Commission will provide access to generic reference numbers for goods when you're re-importing to essentially indicate on customs forms. And you're not submitting these to traces in any capacity, but on customs forms to indicate to customs authorities, hey, this is a re-imported good. This is not a good where I ever needed to submit this to the EU traces system. This already has a due diligence statement. This is basically just to provide some evidence that this good already has an associated due diligence statement. And in the guidance and FAQs, there's essentially a line that customs authorities will be made aware of the generic reference number, the existence of generic reference numbers. So that is the scenario that's included in the guidance and FAQs about re-imports. I'll take a look at additional questions around re-imports in a minute. I'll just walk through the additional updates that were in the EUDR report, and then we'll circle back again. I know we have a lot of questions. Other updates from this EUDR report was the scope was updated. Obviously, this was a pretty significant update. Leather was removed from the EUDR scope. This was something that was anticipated for a while. Leather had been advocating, or the leather industry had been advocating for removal from EUDR scope for quite a long time. Soluble coffee and palm oil derivatives, including soap, were added. And then clarification of scope for certain HS codes, so including HS codes under rubber, cattle, and wood. So you can see that clarification if you look at the annex to the delegated act that was submitted. You can see that clarification for some of those HS codes. And then sample products, waste products, recycled products were excluded. Again, these are elements that have been in discussion for quite a while, but these were really clarified and solidified in this recent report and clarification. And then, as I mentioned, the Commission announced this database for legality resources. They also announced a database for certification resources. This is another big update. The certification database would be a database for third-party certification schemes. This is very important because many operators have third-party certifications associated with the plots of land from which they source. Not all third-party certifications are created equal, obviously, and the Commission has made clear that certain certifications are not applicable to EUDR and are not compliant with EUDR if they use a mass balance approach specifically. So the certification database, the intent of it is to provide some resources on which certifications are relevant to EUDR. What it does not do is it does not say if you have this certification, you no longer need to do any other type of legality due diligence for EUDR, but it essentially does provide additional detail on these are certifications that are relevant. This covers X, Y, and Z, or it will do this once this is live. This covers X, Y, and Z for EUDR due diligence. So that is another resource that I anticipate will be very, very useful once it is live. Again, they haven't provided dates on when these resources will be available, but they have said they'll be available before the December deadline. So we'll see when those are launched. And then, of course, the timeline is confirmed. No further delays. So December will be the timeline for the regulation. So I think we can probably dive into some of these questions, Leo. I don't know if there's any that you specifically want to.
Well,
Uh,
I think we had, I think one you addressed, but so if a company um, is not able to get the DDS number and they're a re-importer, then this generic DDS number could be applied, right? So
Correct.
I'll provide that answer in writing here. Uh, there's one question that I do want to get into a little bit because we do. So Marissa and I and the whole team at Sourcemap get involved when there is a government investigation of a supply chain for one of our customers. Obviously, we provide the software that contains all the data that's used for those responses. So the question here, and this is I know this would be a speculative response because nobody's really seen what these investigations look like. But do you have any idea of how an audit would be conducted? What could trigger it? What evidence would be required, what the timeline would be. We know we have some sort of points of reference from other investigations that we've seen, but what are your thoughts on that?
So it's a good question. One thing that I can say is there have been some competent authorities in some of the member states that have been conducting mock audits since last summer, and some that are actually continuing to do so through this summer. Right now, the mock audits have actually focused primarily on the deforestation element. Some are starting to look at the legality due diligence element, but obviously that is the more complicated element to audit. So they're focusing a little bit more on, looking at, are the polygons that have been submitted actually, have they actually been screened for deforestation? Do they meet the criteria under the law? That's really what we've seen. Some of the reports are available around those. We actually have published on Sourcemap's website a little bit about some of those mock audits. And I'm happy to share some of those details if folks want to email us after this webinar. But really, what I can share is it will look a little bit different, frankly, based on which competent authority within each member state conducts an audit. That is the element of EUDR that's a little bit different from if you're looking at an investigation conducted by, for example, CBP within the United States. Um, that's one body that's conducting a investigation. If we're looking at an EUDR audit, you're looking at member states, competent authorities within the member states. They do have to follow a some element of a criteria here, but it's not necessarily going to be uniform for all of the member states. There's a little bit of flexibility there. But the guidance that I would say is ensure that you have all of your data elements organized. The more that you have everything in one place, and that's why we're always suggesting, keeping a sort of a data repository, having a data repository, using a partner that's actually able to keep your data organized. That is the best advice because in the event of an audit, when you're scrambling to pull everything together, that is the most that's really when you're wasting time. But these audits, these mock audits that competent authorities have been conducting, I think have been really illuminating because you are seeing them focus a little bit more on the deforestation element than the legality element. But again, there are some that are happening this summer that are starting to look at legality. So that is an important element that I think companies should make sure that they're covering because member states are starting to figure out how can we audit this element as well.
Yeah. And I'll just add a few sort of rules of thumb. It is far too late to start collecting primary data once you get an investigation. And in many cases, your suppliers don't have the data to provide by then. The supply chains for these tropical commodities are very long and they may have been produced years ago. So one thing you cannot do is collect this data after the investigation starts. It may no longer exist or be available to you, and that could drag out into months. Another thing is, we aim to have all the data, ready for reporting within 24, 48, 72 hours of a request. Certainly the platform contains all the data. there's an extensive legal review that most of our customers undertake before they respond to an investigation. And so it's not so much how long will it take you to get the data as much as it is how long will it take your lawyers to formulate a response. And so you want the data essentially right away so that your lawyers have time to formulate a response and so that the sum total does not appear to be something that you were negligent about, that you had it under your fingertips the whole time. But that's a soft answer. Just a quick clarification, Marissa. Another question is just we use the term primary upstream operator here, and I think we use it to distinguish from this new first downstream operator that the
Yeah.
EU started to talk about. Primary upstream operator, not technically a term within
It is
the
actually.
EUDR.
Yep,
It is,
it
okay.
is. So this is a term that the commission has started using in its specifically to differentiate with the first downstream
Okay.
operator. That is the operator that is placing the good on the market for the first time. Um, again, this really is just to distinguish between that upstream operator who is placing the good on the market for the first time, the first downstream operator, and subsequent downstream operators are the suppliers further downstream. One other resource that I do just want to point to that the commission did publish a little earlier in the year that I think is really helpful when you're looking at your role within the supply chain specifically, either as a upstream operator, a primary operator, or further a downstream operator, is the infographic document that they published. It was either in March or early April. This infographic document, again, if you have not seen that, feel free to email us. You can search for this as well. But this infographic document was just a document that the commission published a little earlier in the spring to make the roles and responsibilities under EUDR a little bit more clear. That's actually where this language that we're referring to is coming from. That's where they sort of started using that terminology a little bit more to differentiate between those roles within the supply chain. But if you are a little confused about where you sit within within the supply chain, I think that infographic document is really helpful, and some of the charts in there are really helpful to look at. So I would strongly suggest seeking that out. And again, if you are confused about where to find that, feel free to reach out to us and we can point you in that direction.
Yeah, it sounds like we're going to have some follow-up documents to share, as well as the recording of the webinar for all of you who are registered. Just some interesting questions about scope, but just to clarify, so is the upstream operator always the importer of record?
Is the upstream operator always the importer of record? I mean, the upstream operator is the importer who is placing the good on the market for the first time. I would not use the word importer because the operator can be exporting a good from the European Union, as long as it is the first time it has been placed on the EU market. I think sometimes we conflate operator with importer, and that's not necessarily the case. Very often, it ends up being the case that the primary operator is importing into the EU versus exporting from the EU, because oftentimes exporters end up being downstream operators, meaning they are exporting goods that were already placed on the EU market. They're downstream operators. They don't need to submit a due diligence statement. But an exporter could be a company that is manufacturing something, manufacturing something within the European Union. It's never been placed on the EU market. They're exporting for the first time. They could be a primary operator as well. Obviously, that's less likely, but there are certainly companies that applies to. So just don't use those terms interchangeably, that an operator is automatically an importer. That is not the case.
Another one is a short one. Has the revision been approved, including the simplification?
The simplification has been approved. The simplification meaning that downstream operators do not need to submit due diligence statements to traces. All of that was approved back in December of 2025. So that none of that is none of those are elements that need to be reapproved by the member states, reapproved by Parliament or the Council. The only elements that do need to be approved are the Commission submitted delegated acts around the scope. The scope, again, is that addition of some of these HS codes. That actually does need to be approved by the member states. It's not anticipated that there will actually be significant pushback on this, but that delegated acts do need to be approved. The other element that does need to be approved is this implementing act regarding updates to the EU Traces system. We haven't actually really touched on this in this webinar, but EU Traces, of course, I know Leo was answering some questions about this in the chat, but EU Traces has been down since February. The Commission submitted an implementing act regarding additional updates to traces that just need to be approved by the member states. The EU Traces system continues to be down while those updates are being made. Implementing acts need to also be approved by the member states. The act has already been submitted. The draft has been circulated. So the member states do need to approve that. So the delegated act and the implementing act do need to be approved. But the simplification in terms of the roles and responsibilities for downstream operators and traders, that has already been approved by Parliament, Council. That is part of the adopted text. So none of that is subject to reapproval as part of anything that's up for discussion right now.
Just another clarification on what does in good faith mean in terms of the
Great
first
question.
downstream operator? Yeah.
Great question. I mean, this is sort of ambiguous language, honestly. But that was a quote, frankly, that's in the guidance and FAQs. It is sort of curious that the Commission has put this in here. Really what they're suggesting here is it's not the downstream operator's job to request that due diligence reference number. If they're not receiving that reference number, they're just allowed to assume that their upstream supplier is not the primary upstream operator. So that to me, and this was why earlier I was suggesting from an audit standpoint, that does sort of protect them. If they're allowed to, quote, in good faith, say, I did not receive a due diligence reference number, that means that my supplier is not a primary upstream operator. If that language is being communicated by the Commission, then to me this suggests that there is some protection from an audit standpoint for the downstream operators and traders. It remains to be seen whether that really will pan out when we actually see what these audits look like. But that's really what that suggests from my perspective. But they haven't elaborated on really what that means, but that is a direct quote. That's what it says in the guidance and FAQs, and it really does just suggest that they are allowed to assume that, and they don't need to, I guess, to expand on that. If they don't need to, if they're allowed to make that assumption, they then don't need to verify that their supplier is needed to send them a reference number. If they're allowed to make that assumption, they don't then need to go and seek out their supplier and say, "Hey, did you mean to send me a due diligence reference number?" So
they don't even have to ask their suppliers.
Exactly.
That's okay. So just to be doubly clear, you don't even have to ask. Basically, this means that only the primary upstream operator is actually responsible for complying with the EUDR and also sending DDS reference numbers to customers, due diligence reports. But it's not your job if you're downstream to ask for the data.
The only correction I would say is I would never say as explicitly complying with it. It's only responsible for the primary operator to comply with EUDR, because obviously downstream operators and traders do have EUDR responsibilities to some regard. But it's not the downstream operator and trader's responsibility to request the due diligence reference number. So yes, I think that has been made clear in the guidance and FAQs, that it's not their responsibility. If they're not receiving that reference number, they don't need to go track down their supplier and ask for that reference number.
We have more questions. We're running out of time, and we have just a couple more items to cover. Um, we're going to keep on answering these. We're going to follow up with everybody. I think there's been an unexpected demand for this, for answering these kinds of questions. Just as a reminder, Sourcemap is a software company that helps automate EUDR compliance. We're not lawyers, so ultimately you'll have to get advice from your counsel on whether you comply and how to comply. We're certainly happy to help automate all these processes and make compliance a reality. If we're getting questions on, very specific things, if you're using the postal service to send goods to Europe, if what exact kinds of documents do you need to prove that something is recycled, or a sample product. So I think all of those we're going to have to answer asynchronously. Is there, I know there's a few points that we wanted to clarify in terms of how the EUDR compliance with the simplification is going to line up with other regulations that certainly companies of a certain complexity are also going to have to comply with. Do you want to touch on any of the last questions around the EUDR compliance in particular before we prepare a packet, including the recording for all of our attendees?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that what I definitely want to leave folks with is, I think that this round of clarification from the commission, it answered a lot of questions, but as always, there are going to be outstanding questions. I would strongly suggest for folks who have really, really specific questions that they feel are unanswered by the guidance and FAQs. There are avenues by which you can submit questions directly to the commission in an attempt to get them answered directly in the guidance and FAQs. We have done this. The companies that we work with have done this, and we've had questions answered very directly in the guidance and FAQs. I would suggest doing that if you have answers that are very specific to your business that you think would benefit from a very explicit answer in the guidance and FAQs. As we said earlier, we will circulate some of those resources that we have been talking about throughout this webinar that the commission has published. I would strongly suggest looking through some of those if you haven't had a chance to look at them. And again, we'll answer some of these questions that we didn't get a chance to get through. As I said, not every question is going to be answered by the commission, but I do think that this clarifies and hopefully lessens a little bit of the stress for downstream operators and traders, because it did provide some needed clarification on the downstream operator and trader responsibilities that I think were left ambiguous between the time of the simplification text being adopted in December and now. So again, we're happy to continue the conversation, and I'm sure we'll have subsequent webinars, frankly, on this topic, since I think there's a lot more to discuss here.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, we're getting more questions as it rolls in, so we're going to also leave you with our contact information and probably another EUDR webinar to clear up any questions, but you'll always be able to reach out to us. I think at this point, with just a couple minutes to go, we won't have time to cover the applicability of EUDR data to other regulations. So we're going to leave that for another session, but suffice to say, when you have built the system of record for EUDR, you have built a transaction level traceability platform that goes back to raw material. That is a platform and that is data that you can reuse for a number of regulations that are also quite weighty and also coming soon in the EU and in North America. So stay tuned for how to make sure that the system you built is not fit for only one purpose. It should, in fact, be able to satisfy a lot of the data requirements of other regulations, and we'd be happy to to provide more detail on that. I also want to call out that we'll be having another webinar on another regulation that is coming quite quickly on the horizon, and that fortunately for you all has a lot of groundings in a regulation that we've already been helping companies deal with for 4 years now on forced labor. So the EU forced labor regulation webinar, we're going to be hosting that in just 2 weeks. So save the date. We'll send around an invitation to register for that. It's a you have our personal emails here, so take advantage of it. But as I'm sure you're no doubt convinced, as Marissa knows a lot about EUDR and the other due diligence regulations. She's the one that most often is speaking with Brussels and with Washington for the US contingent of due diligence regulations. Of course, you can always reach me as well. Our emails are here. Our website is here. I urge you to look around at the various regulations that you could use the system of record for, because you'll save time and money, and it'll be a much easier sell internally at your company if you can find a tool that solves for multiple uses as opposed to just the EUDR. We're going to, so a little too late, but we're not lawyers. This is not legal advice. But we've tried to carry over as much of our experience in implementing EUDR solutions as we could. Any closing words, Marissa?
No, I mean, thank you everyone for joining us today. I think that this has been a great discussion. I hope that you all are able to join us on the 10th and bring your questions. There's a lot to discuss, and luckily with the EU forced labor regulation, just to again do a little promo for that webinar, we will be discussing the draft guidance for the EU forced labor regulation. So we do have some guidance to dive into there, and talk about sort of what's coming down the pike there. So bring your questions, and again, we'll try to answer some of the questions that we didn't get a chance to get to on EUDR in writing. And please reach out to us in follow up if there's anything outstanding that you'd like to discuss. But thank you everyone for joining us this morning/afternoon if you are in the EU. Really appreciate it.